Hello! I hope that you're ready to dive into week 2. Last week we spent our time considering the context of worship, the people that were leading in worship, the culture of our congregation, and the ways in which those things shape how we lead worship. This week we're going to spend our time thinking about the foundation on which our worship is built. There are a few things that I think are good for us to keep in mind as we look closely this week at some biblical and theological foundations of worship. The first is that everything we do in worship teaches something. See, I told you I'd say that a lot. But the reality is that the words that we say, the way that we choose to say them, the songs that we sing, the actions and rituals that we participate in as leaders and as congregants teaches our congregation about who God is and how God is at work in the world. And so we must know what will undergird our choices in leadership and worship so that we can decide what's important and what's not, what we want our congregation to learn and things that we don't. Knowing that we and our congregation believe and why we believe it before we ever sit down to begin planning a worship service is something that's really crucial to our work as leaders. The second thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind this week is that if we're going to build upon biblical and theological foundations for our worship, we have to know some Bible and theology. As worship leaders, we must prepare ourselves for that role of leadership. This means spending time in Scripture and in prayer, because it is only as we know the God that we're worshiping that we can invite others into worship with us. And that means we're going to need to spend some time learning the theology of our faith. This doesn't mean that we all need to go out and get a theology degree, although I do know a good place where you can get one. But what it means is that we need to spend time thinking about theological issues, dialoguing with professors, church leaders, and mentors that we respect and can depend on as we're developing a theology of worship. The next thing that I think that it's important for us to keep in mind is that those of us who are musicians and specifically lead the music portions of our service carry a heavy burden. One of the hardest things to remember as a preacher is that no one is going to go home singing our sermons, but they are going to go home singing the songs that have been played and sung in worship. And it is through these songs that our people are shaped. A man in my church and I were talking about the importance of singing good theology, and he told me about his daughter. He and his daughter were having a conversation, and they were talking about a particular situation in her life, and she described to him the way that she thought that God would act. He was bewildered about why she thought that God would act in this way. He asked her, "Honey, why do you think that? That isn't true about God." And she answered, "But Dad, it's in that song that we sing in church." It's good for us to remember that our music teaches our people, and we are the ones who are responsible for knowing what it is that we're teaching. The final thing that I'd like us to keep in mind as we are looking this week at our foundations is that worship without a foundation will fall flat. I remember a recent chapel service here at Tribeca where the songs that we sang were about a half an inch deep in their theology and in their proclamation of who God was. And at the end of 15 minutes of singing, which musically technically, was really good, I wondered what I had been doing. In talking with the young man who led worship that day, he said that he knew that something was wrong when he picked the songs for chapel that day, and knew even more when he was leading that day that something was missing. And that something was the foundation on which our worship is built. Our services of worship will only be as strong as the foundations on which they're built. Well, in this week's reading, Connie Cherry spends her chapters talking about the biblical and Christological foundations for worship, and she has a lot of really great things to say that remind us of the importance of this. I hope that in your reading in Cherry, and also in the supplemental lectures in which I try to draw out some of the important points of Cherry, you begin to get a sense of the foundation which undergirds our worship and the importance of it. I also recognize that for some of us, the foundations on which our worship are built are going to be different in different contexts. The question that I want you to continually come back to in your work this week is, what does this mean for my work as a worship leader, and what will it mean for my congregation? As always, if you have any questions about what you're reading or looking for some insight from your classmates, please feel free to post in the class discussion section or send an email via Connect. Have a great week.